We take the breath so we can grow the life. I want to start with a confession because I think it's the only honest way into this topic. 2 years ago, I had a book outline sitting on my desk for 11 months. 11 months! Not because I didn't want to write it, not because I didn't have time. I had entire Saturday mornings free, coffee made, laptop open, cursor blinking on an empty page. And I would sit there for 20 minutes, feel nothing, and go make more coffee. If you've ever sat in front of something you actually care about, a workout, a business idea, a difficult conversation, a degree, a relationship you know needs attention, and felt absolutely nothing where motivation is supposed to be, I need you to know something before we go any further. You were never lazy. You were waiting for a signal your brain was never going to send you first. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why that signal doesn't come the way you think it does, and I'm going to give you a specific 90-second sequence that creates it on demand. Not motivation as a mood you wait around for, motivation as a mechanism you can trigger. But before I get into the mechanism, I want your honesty on something, because this only works if it's a two-way conversation. Tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you've been meaning to start for the longest time? Not the thing you're doing, the thing that's been sitting there, waiting, while you wait for a feeling that isn't coming. I'm going to read those, and I think you're going to be surprised how many other people typed the exact same thing you did. Now, let's talk about why that thing is still sitting there. Somewhere along the way, almost all of us absorb the same broken formula. Feel motivated, then take action. It's baked into how we talk about ambition. People say things like, "I just don't feel like going to the gym today," as if feeling like it was ever supposed to arrive first. We wait for inspiration to strike before we open the document. We wait to feel ready before we make the call. We treat motivation like weather, something that happens to us that we either get lucky with or we don't. Here's the problem with that formula. It has the order backwards. And once you understand why, you'll never look at your own procrastination the same way again. Motivation isn't a cause, it's a byproduct. And the thing it's a byproduct of is not thinking, not planning, not journaling about your goals. It's a very specific, very measurable chemical event that happens in a part of your brain most of us have never been taught to work with directly. I'm talking about dopamine, and I want to be careful here because dopamine has become one of those words that gets thrown around so loosely online that it's basically lost its meaning. People use it to explain everything from phone addiction to why sugar tastes good. So let's actually get specific, because the specific version of this story is the version that's going to change how you operate starting today. For a long time, dopamine was sold to us as the pleasure chemical. You do something enjoyable, dopamine fires, you feel good. Simple, tidy, and mostly wrong. Researchers running experiments on reward and prediction found something much stranger. Dopamine doesn't fire mainly when you get the reward. It fires mainly in anticipation of the reward. And more specifically, it fires based on whether the reward is better than expected, worse than expected, or right on schedule. It's not a pleasure signal, it's a prediction signal. Your brain is constantly running a background forecast of what's about to happen, and dopamine is the chemical readout of whether reality is beating that forecast. Here's why this matters for the 11 months that outline sat on my desk. When a task has been avoided for a long time, your brain's forecast for it becomes almost entirely negative. It predicts effort, discomfort, and an outcome so far away it barely registers as real. With the forecast that grim, there's no positive prediction error to generate dopamine from. No dopamine, no drive, no pull toward the desk. You're not broken. Your forecasting system is just running on old, bad data, and it will keep running on that data forever unless something interrupts it. This is the part that took me the longest to actually accept, because it's almost insulting in its simplicity. You don't need motivation to start the task. You need one small, real action to generate the tiny hit of dopamine that makes the next 30 seconds slightly more appealing than they were a moment ago. Starting doesn't require motivation. Starting creates it. Once I understood the mechanism, the actual fix turned out to be almost embarrassingly small. I want to give you the exact structure, because vague advice like just start small has never fixed anything for anyone. Precision is the whole point here. Step 1, the first 30 seconds.
Pick the task you've been avoiding and reduce it to something that feels almost pointless. Not write the chapter. Open the document and type one sentence, even a bad one. Not go to the gym, put on the shoes, and stand by the door. The goal of this step isn't progress. The goal is to give your brain a real, physical action to attach a prediction to. Step 2. The next 30 seconds. Actually notice, out loud if you need to, that the discomfort you predicted didn't fully show up. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but is doing the heaviest lifting in the entire sequence. Your forecasting system predicted this would feel unbearable. It didn't. That gap between prediction and reality is exactly the kind of positive prediction error that generates a dopamine response. You're not hyping yourself up. You're correcting a forecast with real data. Step 3. The final 30 seconds. Take one more small action, slightly bigger than the first. Write a second sentence. Take 5 steps toward the gym door. This is where most people expect the payoff to arrive, and instead what actually happens is quieter and more useful. The third action tends to feel measurably easier than the first one did, not because willpower kicked in, because your brain just received 2 rounds of evidence that the forecast was wrong, and it's already recalibrating. 90 seconds, 3 steps, no pep talk required. And here's the detail that made this stick for me personally. This isn't a trick to get through one task. Every time you run this sequence, you're not just starting a task, you're retraining the actual prediction model your brain uses for that category of task. The 10th time you do this with the same avoided task, the starting resistance is measurably lower than the first time because the forecast itself has updated. I want to spend a minute on why the advice most of us were given, just push through it, just use discipline, just want it more, was never going to solve this problem, because I think a lot of people have spent years quietly blaming themselves for a system failure that had nothing to do with their character. Willpower operates like a muscle under load. It can override the forecast for a while through sheer force, but it's metabolically expensive to sustain, and it depletes over the course of a day. Every decision you force yourself through by gritting your teeth draws from the same limited pool.
By the time you get to the thing you've been avoiding for 11 months, you've usually already spent that pool on a dozen smaller frictions you didn't even notice. The emails, the small conflicts, the decisions about what to eat. The 90-second sequence doesn't draw from that same pool because it isn't overriding the forecast, it's correcting it. That's the difference between forcing a door open every single time and installing a new hinge so it swings freely on its own. One of those gets exhausting. The other one just works, quietly in the background, every time you use it. I think this reframe matters beyond just productivity, honestly. I spent a long time assuming that successful people I admired simply had more discipline than I did, more raw willpower, some trait I was missing. What I've come to believe instead, after digging into this, is that most of them had simply built better forecasting loops without necessarily knowing the mechanism behind it. They made starting small enough, often enough, that their brains stopped predicting doom every time a hard task showed up. It was never a talent gap, it was a data gap. I want to tell you what actually happened with that outline, because I think the honest version is more useful than a polished success story. The first time I tried this, I didn't write a chapter. I wrote one sentence, closed the laptop, and felt almost nothing, which looking back is exactly what the mechanism predicts. One data point isn't enough to meaningfully shift a forecast built over 11 months of avoidance. I did it again the next day. Same thing. One sentence, closed the laptop. By around day 6, something shifted that I didn't expect. I sat down expecting the usual dread, and it just wasn't as loud. I wrote 3 sentences without meaning to. By day 12, I was writing for 20 minutes some days without setting out to. I'm not telling you this to say the book got finished in 2 weeks, because it didn't. That would be a lie, and I'm not interested in selling you a fantasy timeline. What changed wasn't the size of my output right away. What changed first was the size of the resistance standing between me and starting. That's the actual thing this fixes, and it's the thing almost nobody talks about because I sat down without dreading it. Doesn't sound as exciting as I wrote 50,000 words in a month. But it's the part that has to happen first, and for most of us, it's the part that never gets addressed at all.
I know what some of you are thinking right now because I thought it too the first time I read this research. This sounds too small to matter. My problem isn't 90 seconds of resistance, it's that I have a genuinely overwhelming amount to do. I want to take that seriously instead of brushing past it because it's a fair point. Here's what I say back. The size of the eventual task has almost nothing to do with the size of the resistance at the starting line. A 10-minute task you've been avoiding and a 10-month project you've been avoiding can produce an identical wall of resistance at the moment of starting. Because the resistance isn't calibrated to the actual size of the work. It's calibrated to how badly your brain has forecasted that first moment of contact with the task. This sequence isn't designed to shrink the project. It's designed to get you through the doorway, because once you're actually inside the task, a completely different set of mental resources takes over, ones that don't require this kind of forecasting correction at all. Getting through the doorway has always been the actual problem. We just kept mistaking it for a problem of scale. The other objection I hear a lot is some version of, but what about the days I genuinely have no energy, not just resistance? That's a real and different category, and I don't want to pretend a breathing-adjacent mental trick fixes exhaustion, poor sleep, or something that needs a medical attention. What I'm describing here is specifically for the resistance that shows up even when you do have the capacity, the days where you know you could do it and just don't start. If what you're feeling is genuine depletion rather than avoidance, that's a conversation for rest, for sleep, and if it's persistent, for a conversation with an actual doctor, not for a 90-second trick, and I'd rather tell you that honestly than pretend one framework solves everything. There's one more piece of the mechanism I left out on purpose because I wanted the 90-second sequence to land first, before I complicated it. But if you want to actually understand why this works, instead of just trusting me that it does, you need to know about the second system involved, because it explains why repetition matters so much more than intensity. Deep in the brain sits a structure called the basal ganglia, and one of its main jobs is pattern storage, specifically storing sequences of action so they can eventually run with less and less effortful conscious input from you. This is the same system responsible for the fact that you can drive a familiar route home while thinking about something else entirely, or type on a keyboard without looking at your fingers. Once a sequence has been run enough times, the basal ganglia essentially takes over its execution, freeing up the more effortful conscious part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, for something else. Here's why this matters for avoidance. Avoidance is also a stored pattern. Every time you approach a task and back away from it, you're not just failing to make progress, you're actively reinforcing a stored sequence that says, this task, this discomfort, retreat. The basal ganglia doesn't judge whether the pattern is helpful, it just strengthens whatever gets repeated. 11 months of opening a document and closing it again wasn't neutral, it was training, just training in the wrong direction. This is why the 90-second sequence isn't a one-time trick, even though it can absolutely work the first time you try it. What you're actually doing every time you run it is competing with a much older, much more rehearsed pattern. The first few times, the old pattern is still stronger, which is exactly why day 1 and day 6 might not feel dramatically different for you. You're not failing. You're in the middle of a rewrite that takes repeated, unglamorous repetition to actually take hold. Somewhere around the second week, for most people, the new pattern crosses a threshold where it starts to compete seriously with the old one. And that's usually when people describe the shift I described earlier, sitting down and noticing that dread just isn't as loud anymore. I want to widen the lens for a moment because I think there's a trap in talking about this only in the context of one outline or one gym session. The mechanism doesn't care what category of task it's applied to, and I think it's worth walking through a few different areas so you can see how the exact same 90 seconds shows up differently depending on where you use it. In physical health, the avoided task is almost never the workout itself. It's the transition into workout clothes, the drive to the gym, the first few minutes on the machine before your body actually warms up.
I've talked to people who can run 5 miles without much complaint once they're moving, but who have spent years stuck at the putting on the shoes stage, mistaking that stuck point for a lack of fitness motivation, when it was actually just an uncorrected forecast about how unpleasant the first 60 seconds would feel. In work and career situations, the avoided task is usually a conversation rather than a physical action. The email asking for a raise, the difficult feedback you owe a colleague, the phone call to a client you know is upset. These feel different from a gym session, but the mechanism underneath is identical. Your forecasting system has modeled the conversation as catastrophic, usually far more catastrophic than it turns out to be. And the 90-second version here looks like opening the email draft and writing one honest sentence, or picking up the phone and dialing the first 3 digits before you let yourself hang up. In relationships, this shows up as the conversation you've been meaning to have with a partner, a parent, or a friend about something that's been sitting unspoken for months. I want to be careful here because I'm not suggesting you rush a conversation that genuinely needs preparation or the right moment. What I am suggesting is that most of us aren't actually waiting for the right moment. We're waiting for the dread to go away first, and it won't because dread isn't information about the conversation. It's a forecast, usually an inflated one, about how it will go. In every one of these categories, the fix looks the same in structure, even though the specific action changes completely. Smallest possible real step. Notice the gap between the prediction and what actually happened. One slightly bigger step. It's not a productivity hack limited to to-do lists. It's a correction to how your brain handles anything it has learned to dread. After I first talked about an early version of this idea, one of you left a comment I think about often, and I want to share it because I think it captures something I couldn't have said as well myself. She wrote that she'd been putting off calling her mother for almost a year after a disagreement neither of them had fully addressed. Not estranged, not dramatic, just avoided. Every day she'd think about it, feel a wave of dread, and decide tomorrow would be a better day. Tomorrow, for almost a year, never came. She said she tried the smallest version of this she could think of, not calling, just opening her phone to her mother's contact page and looking at it for 10 seconds. That was it the first day. She said it felt almost silly to count that as anything, but she noticed exactly the way the mechanism predicts that looking at the contact page wasn't nearly as unbearable as she'd built it up to be in her head. The next day, she did the same thing and let her thumb hover over the call button for a few seconds before putting the phone down. The day after that, she called, and the conversation, in her words, was over in 4 minutes and ended with both of us laughing, which was the last thing I expected. I share that story not because every avoided conversation resolves that cleanly. Some don't, and that's a separate, harder conversation. I share it because it's such a clean example of the actual mechanism at work outside of a gym or a desk. The task her brain had rated as unbearable turned out to be 4 minutes long. The unbearable part was never the phone call. It was the 11 months of an uncorrected forecast standing in front of it. I want to flag a few ways people tend to get this slightly wrong when they first try it, because I've made a couple of these mistakes myself. The first mistake is making the initial step too big out of impatience. If you've been avoiding something for a long time, there's a temptation to want the first step to already feel like meaningful progress, so people skip the tiny, almost embarrassing first action and jump straight to something that still carries real resistance. That defeats the entire purpose. The smallness of the first step is not a compromise, it's the mechanism itself. If the first step still generates real dread, it's too big, and there's no shame in shrinking it further. The second mistake is skipping the noticing step, which I think is the most overlooked part of the whole sequence. People do the small action and immediately rush to the next one without consciously registering that the discomfort didn't fully show up. That noticing is where the actual correction happens. Without it, you're just doing a small action without giving your brain the chance to update its forecast, which is a bit like collecting evidence and never actually reading it. The third mistake is expecting a single round to fix a pattern that took months or years to build. I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating because it's the reason most people who try this once and don't feel transformed give up on it entirely. This is a repeated evidence process, not a one-time trick, even though it can occasionally feel like a one-time trick when you get lucky with a task that wasn't actually as avoided as you thought. Before I move to the close, I want to draw a line between two things that get confused constantly, because I think the confusion is part of why so many of us have felt like failures over something that was never actually a character flaw. There's a difference between not wanting to do something and dreading the entry point into something you actually want. Most of the examples I've given you today fall into the second category, even though they feel identical from the inside. The outline sitting on my desk for 11 months wasn't something I didn't want to write. I wanted that book more than almost anything else I was working on that year. The dread wasn't a signal that I'd chosen the wrong project. It was a signal that my forecasting system had gone stale, nothing more. This distinction matters because a lot of advice out there tells you to interpret resistance as information about whether you actually want the thing. Feel resistance, the thinking goes, and maybe that's your gut telling you this isn't right for you. Sometimes that's true, but far more often, in my experience and in the stories people have shared with me, the resistance is just an old, uncorrected prediction with nothing to do with whether the goal is right. The way you tell the difference isn't by thinking harder about it. It's by running the 90-second sequence and paying attention to what happens on the other side. If the dread lifts measurably after a few small real actions, you're looking at a stale forecast. If it doesn't lift at all, even after real, repeated contact with the task, that's actually useful information. It might genuinely not be the right project, the right relationship, the right path. But you can't know which one you're dealing with from the couch, only from the doorway. I bring this up because I don't want anyone leaving this video thinking the goal is to bulldoze through every feeling of hesitation you ever have. That's not what this is. This is specifically about the category of resistance that shows up around things you already know you want, where the only thing standing between you and the work is a brain running old data.
Learning to tell that category apart from genuine misalignment is, honestly, its own skill, and it's one that gets sharper the more times you actually run the sequence and watch what happens. I mentioned the creed at the start of this video, and I want to come back to it now that you understand the mechanism, because I don't think it's a coincidence that it works the way it does. We take the breath so we can grow the life. On the surface, that line is about a literal breath, and in other conversations on this channel, that's exactly what we mean. But underneath it, there's a pattern that applies to almost everything we've been talking about today. The breath isn't the goal. It's the smallest possible real action available to you in any given moment. The one thing your body can always do, regardless of how your brain has forecasted the next hour. And every time you take it deliberately, you're giving your nervous system a tiny piece of real evidence to work with, instead of a prediction built on dread. The 90-second sequence for motivation and the 4-minute breathing patterns I've talked about in other videos are, underneath the surface, doing something structurally similar. They both work by interrupting a forecast with a small, undeniable piece of present moment evidence. One recalibrates your stress response, the other recalibrates your drive to start. Different systems in the body, same underlying principle. Small, real, immediate action beats waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive on its own schedule. Here's my ask, and it's a specific one, not a vague, let me know what you think. Pick one thing right now, one single thing you've been avoiding, and do not pick the biggest one on your list. Pick something you'd rate as a 5 or 6 out of 10 in terms of dread, not a 10 out of 10. The mechanism works best when you give it a fair fight to win, not a mountain to climb on day one. Do the 90 seconds. First 30, the smallest possible real action. Second 30, actually notice specifically that it wasn't as bad as predicted. Third 30, one slightly bigger action. Then come back to the comments and tell me 2 things. What was the task, and what did minute 2 actually feel like for you? I mean that literally. I want to know if you noticed the gap between what you expected and what actually happened, because that gap is the entire mechanism working in real time. And putting it into words for me and for everyone else reading the comments makes it more real for you, not less. I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it because I mean it every time. This channel isn't built to rack up views from people who watch once and disappear. It's built to be a place where a few hundred of us are actually doing the work together, comparing notes, being honest about the 11-month outlines and the shoes we never quite put on. If that's not the kind of channel you're here for, no hard feelings. There's plenty of content out there that's just entertainment, and that's fine. But if it is what you're here for, the way you tell me is by showing up in that comment section and being specific instead of just typing "great video." Specific is what builds this. Specific is what I actually read. One more thing, and then I'll let you go start whatever you've been avoiding. Whatever popped into your head when I asked you what you've been meaning to start, I want you to do the first 30 seconds of it right now, before you close this video. Not after lunch, not tomorrow morning, right now in the next 30 seconds while the idea is still sitting there fresh, instead of hardening back into another day of avoidance. Open the document, put on the shoes, send the first line of the message you've been drafting in your head for a week. Hit subscribe. I know how small that sounds compared to whatever the finished version of your goal looks like in your head. I know it feels almost silly to call opening a document or looking at a contact page doing the work, but I'd rather you leave this video having actually done the smallest real version of the thing than leave it feeling inspired for 20 minutes and then nothing. Inspiration by itself has never finished a single project in the history of anyone's life. Evidence has, and the only way to generate evidence is to act first in the smallest way available to you and let the feeling catch up afterwards, the way it was always designed to. Your brain doesn't need a reason to feel motivated before you move. It needs one small piece of real evidence that moving wasn't as bad as it predicted. Give it that evidence and watch what it does with the second 30 seconds on its own. We take the breath so we can grow the life. I'll see you in the comments. Tell me what you started. Talk soon.